Yeah, okay. So this paper is towards a formalization of value-based actions and consequentialist ethics. This is I'm Adam Wyner, and this is joint work with Tomasz Zurek and Dorota Stachura Zurek. We've had a couple of papers, well, Tomasz and I have had a couple of papers on developing value-based reasoning and value-based actions, and this is part of that overall work. So next slide, please. Thank you for this. Sorry about that. So outline is we'll talk a little bit about consequentialist ethics, give a problem statement about how agents are guided with respect to ethical behavior. We'll introduce a little bit of this value-based formal reasoning framework that Tomasz and I have developed. We'll then turn to a very familiar approach using state transitions for actions using strips, and then incorporate or integrate value-based formal reasoning with strips. We'll give a very simple example just to show what this looks like, and then some conclusions. So next slide, please. Thank you. There are three main normative ethical theories: the ontology, which is about obligations and prohibitions; virtue ethics, about irreducible virtue concepts such as benevolence; and then a notion of consequentialism, where consequentialism is about whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of that act. And let me just make a note here that some may differentiate ethics and morality theory, others may not. We're not really engaging in that discussion, so we're sort of taking these as more or less synonymous. There's some differences between whether these are about individuals or about groups. So next slide, please. Amongst the variants of consequentialism, our model is called satisficing consequentialism, meaning that the values that are selected, they may be less than optimal, but they're good enough consequences for the particular purpose at hand or with respect to a particular agent. So it's whether or not the consequences that follow are satisfactory enough for the agent. It's pluralistic in the sense that there are a variety of values that can be considered. And we'll say a little bit later about what we're considering here. It's act-based in the sense that consequences are evaluated for a single act. And as you'll see later, we can have plans where there are consequences considered for a chain of actions that you can have. It's preferential in the sense that each agent seeks their own value preference fulfillment. So this is, in that sense, highly individualistic. There's a lot more to say about ethical theories or moral theories and the implications of instantiating or implementing them. We don't really just get into discussions about this in this paper. For our purposes, this is kind of building a foundation for thinking about actions and values in a computational framework. So next slide, please. How do values shape an agent's behavior in this particular point of view? What are values? Here, general notion would be they're abstract concepts which allow for the estimation of a state of affairs and which influence one's behavior. So you're looking to say, make decisions about what states of affairs that you should attain, what actions you should execute to attain them, and those might be based on your values. And you may decide which action to execute depending on your behavior. Sorry, depending on your value. The basic intuition here is that an agent performs actions in order to bring about a situation that's more compatible with the agent's values than it was. So sort of the preconditioned state is not so compatible with an agent's values, and the post-conditioned state is going to be more compatible with the agent's values. Next slide, please. So the basics of this value-based formal reasoning, we have a set of agents, we have a set of atomic propositions, we have a notion of when propositions are incompatible, so they're just pairs of propositions where they cannot occur in any state or any set, and this relation is symmetric. And in this sense, we say that they're objectively incompatible. This might be logical incompatibility or pragmatic incompatibility, where pragmatic here would be You can't be born in Paris and born in New York City. We have a set of values where each element of value is an abstract object, which expresses a value concept like freedom or security. Uh, like Nadine mentioned, there may be different frameworks for considering values, what sets of values, the corporate values, the individual values. We may broadly think in terms of Schwartz's value constructions. It's not particularly relevant here, but it's good for giving concrete examples. We have a scale, which is a totally ordered finite set of scalar elements, and we use these for, in effect, weighting the values with respect to an agent. We have, in addition, a notion of weight, which is scale or question mark, where question mark is a designated entity. That means the weight's indeterminate, or it may be taken as not relevant for a particular agent. And it's also unordered with respect to the other elements of scale. So if you try to compare question mark with some other elements of scale, the result is going to be false. Next slide, please. So we have, as part of the basics, two functions, which together are going to give us what we're going to call an agent's value-based worldview. The first function is the agent's value profile, given by this function agent value to weight, which indicates just the importance that the agent ascribes to the value. So this is something that you might commonly see on value questionnaires. You know, is family important to you? Rated on 1 to 5, where 1 means not valuable and 5 means valuable. These kinds of value rankings are very widespread. They're used for employment and things like that. So we're using a similar kind of notion here. The higher the weight, the more important the value is, and the lower the weight, the less important value is. And so we have that just as a function there. This is a total function from all the agents and all the values to some weight that they give it. And a question mark indicates that if you have a question mark for the weight, it indicates that the value is indeterminate with respect to that agent. Next slide, please. Then we have an agent's value assessment, where the agent looks at each proposition and assesses it with respect to a value and a weight. Okay, so given an agent a value and a proposition, it outputs a weight, which expresses the agent's disposition towards a proposition with respect to values and weights. So in that sense, it's saying, is a particular proposition kind of very representative of, let's say, family, or not, very low weighting with respect to family, or with respect to freedom? Do we have a proposition which is highly rated with respect to freedom, with respect to that agent, or very low? This again is a total function. The question mark again signals that there are props that are not assessed. Next slide, please. And we can make a comparison between these two functions. They're conceptually distinct, even though they have similar kind of elements to them. The agent value to weight expresses an agent's ideal and global view on values, while agent value prop weight expresses an agent's assessment of particular propositions in terms of their association with that value. Okay, next slide, please. So we can put them together. We want to reflect an agent's value-based worldview. That is, we want to gather together all the propositions that are compatible with the agent's values. And so in words, we'll have a formula on the next slide, but in words, this is the weight in an agent's value profile that the agent assigns to a proposition relative to value must not be less than the weight in the agent's value assessment that the agent assigns to that value. So what we create here is a kind of filter on a proposition, whether or not the proposition passes the agent's value-based filter. Let's have the next slide, please. So we call this prop-based clean. This is, in effect, a very strong statement where every proposition that's considered has to be such that its weight cannot be less than the agent's value to weight. So it only gathers those propositions into a set which have a sufficient weight to pass with respect to what the agent thinks the value's weight should be. Okay, so it's saying, these are the propositions that are in effect most supportive or most indicative of the agent's values. Can we have the next slide, please? So a little bit of some notes on this. For a particular agent, a lower weight on a particular value in the agent's value profile indicates that there's a lower discriminatory threshold on the acceptability of propositions with respect to that value. So if you say, family values, family is not really very important to me, that means that a lot of propositions are going to pass through so long as they are weighted higher with respect to family values. So in that sense, it's agent's value profile is less discriminatory when it's low. We should also note that any prop-based clean can contain incompatible propositions because we're not saying that this is a knowledge base that contains only consistent propositions. We use this later for reasoning, but not in this particular paper. Moreover, two agents can each accept the same proposition, yet for different settings of values and weights. We think that this is a very interesting attribute of this approach because two people can agree on what to do or a proposition, but for very, very different reasons based on their values. We assume that prop-based clean represents static or all at once and private and inaccessible to other associations of value weights to expressions by an agent. We haven't added a variety of aspects of dynamic or context, dynamics or context to this particular work because we wanted to fix some of the basics for ourselves. And we also want to say that the propositions in prop-based clean don't relate to truth or belief because there have been some comments about our work about what this represents. It's in effect saying the agent selects those propositions that they want to talk about that are consonant with their values. Next slide, please. We can also have a complement to prop-based clean, which in effect all of those propositions which don't make it into prop-based clean. This is quite useful for later as we see, but it's worth having the complement set expressed there. Next slide, please. And now we want to turn to talking about state transitions, and we're going to use a basic definition of strips, really largely because it's familiar to everybody and it works very straightforwardly as a way of integrating our approach to value-based reasoning to actions. So we assume that there are a set of states and that these are simply sets of consistent propositions. And we're going to use to model ethical decision-making. Again, in the transition system, we're going to use strips, and it's a very simple example. For this presentation, we don't introduce a planning algorithm or choice mechanisms between two equally executable actions. We're going to leave that for the future. We're just focusing on individual state transitions by way of introducing these kind of fundamental notions that we work with. Next slide, please. So strips is just a quadruple in which we have following components. I'm assuming that some of this is familiar from looking at state transitions. We have a set of conditions, which are just propositional variables. We've introduced those already. We have a set of operators, which themselves are quadruples, where we have X as the conditions that must be true for the action to be executed. We have Y, the conditions that must be false for the action to be executed. Z are the post-conditions that are to be made true, that are added to the post-condition state. T are the post-conditions that are made false, that are removed from the post-condition state in terms of the transition from the precondition state to the post-condition state. We assume that we have some initial state, and then we have the goal specification, which has two parts. The N of what we want to achieve that's going to be made true, and the M part, which is what we want to make false. So next slide, please. And so what we want to do is we have two parts to integrate value-based formal reasoning into strips. One part is to assume that the goal state N is consistent relative to the agent's prop base clean. That is, the goals that the agent wants to achieve are states in which the propositions of that goal state of N are subsets, in effect, of prop base clean. That is, are propositions which are most compatible with the agent's value profile. So we simply introduce this as a constraint on N. So when we have the goals relative to an agent, the goals that need to be made true are a subset of the agent's prop base clean. That is, are most propositions that are most compatible with the agent's goal values. And we also assume that the end state is consistent. Next slide, please. And the other component that we have is we want actions to introduce propositions relative to an agent's prop base clean. So we have in the definition there, we have what actions are. And we've already said something about what the goal is. So we have goal relative to an agent. We also want to make the actions relative to an agent. And the way that we do that is we take the Z, that is the propositions which are added in the transition from the precondition state to the post-condition state. The propositions that are added are going to be elements that are from the agent's prop base clean. So this is to say that the actions that the agent executes are those such that they introduce propositions in the post-condition state which are compatible with their values. At this point, we're not eliminating propositions that are incompatible with an agent's value, and also there may be propositions that are inherited by inertia, and we can take a look at that a bit later. Next slide, please. So here as an example, we've just got several more slides to give an example. We suppose a set of propositions. We suppose an agent's prop base clean has P2, P3, P4. These are the propositions that are most compatible with the agent's value profile. And we assume an initial state P1, P2, and we have three operators. So you'll note that this sentence here, the operators that are compatible with the agent 0, only action 1 and action 3 are compatible with the agent's value profile, because you see in the third component, right, we have the propositions that are added to the in the transition are P3 and P5, but you note that P3 may be the agent's prop base clean, but P5 is not. Now, and we have the agent's goal here as trying to achieve P4. In standard strips, that is before we consider the agent's prop base clean, there may be two possible plans that we would have. That is, we could execute O1 followed by O3, which in the final state contains P2, P3, P4, or we could execute O2 followed by O3, which in the final state contains 1 through 5. Next slide, please. But in the version that we have, where there's a constraint on the actions that can be executed in the plan, not all of these plans can be carried out by the agent. That is, in particular, some of the actions are not those which are compatible with the agent's value profile. So that is, the sequence of actions O2 to O3 is not compatible. And furthermore, it gives in the final state P1 and P5, and P5 is not in the agent's prop base clean, although that's a necessary condition for us to have actions and or to have goals with respect to agents. And you also note that the final state given inertia contains P1, which is also not in the agent's prop base clean. So there are two aspects in which the final state that we achieve is not compatible with the agent's value profile, but they want to achieve relative to their values. Next slide, please. So we have an expression here which allows us to remove propositions which are incompatible with an agent's prop base clean. So we want to remove inherited unacceptable propositions. We can have some discussion about whether you're allowed to do this, sort of the nuclear option where you can remove all the bad propositions all at once, or whether you kind of remove them incrementally. Basically, the version here that's given is to remove bad things, that is to remove things from to see that the things that you don't like are removed from the post-condition state, things that you don't want to be true. Next slide, please. So the mechanism takes into consideration the agent's values. The consequences of the actions are relative to the agent's value profile and value assessment. They're individualized, that is, individualized relative to the agent, because it's the agent that's determining what their value profile is in the value assessment. So there's not an assessment with respect to a universal hierarchy of values. We can deal with undesirable propositions by either ignoring them in a liberal option or removing them, as I just mentioned. We could relativize strips to different agents. We have already done that, but we haven't actually had any interaction amongst the agents. So in that sense, it's just about one agent at this point. And we could imagine that there would be some possibility of cooperation with respect to an agent's values and the propositions that they execute. We haven't done that, but we're looking forward to doing that in future work. So next slide, please. And the reason that's just related to consequentialism is that it focuses on the consequences related to states of affairs. The agents filter out the propositions, which ensure that the state of affairs are good enough in moral terms, and that's tied to this notion of satisficing variant of consequentialism. And it's also individualized to the value profile of the agent, so it associates with this notion of individualization with consequentialism. So can we have the next slide, please? So one of the things that we can say about this is we've experimented with this in the sense of it represents one particular version of consequentialism. It would be quite interesting to take this basic approach and see how we can experiment and represent other versions of consequentialism, and then kind of give some computational framework for reasoning about different kinds of ethical theories. Okay, thank you very much.